Testing. Okay. Okay. I'm just going to tell folks. Good morning, everyone. If you want to grab any last-minute food items, we're going to get started in about a minute. Ken, will you give him, just not quite yet. All right, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started because we have some announcements and introduction for this morning's speaker. It's amazing to see the room this filled, really thrilled. I clearly underestimated. So to get started this morning, the first thing I want to say, I'm Paul Zakrzewski, by the way. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications at CBB. Thank you, Stephen. The first thing I want to say is none of this would be possible without our amazing SML breakfast crew, our volunteer crew. So if you could give them a big round of applause this morning, that's them. These are the folks that make this breakfast possible. Thank you. Just a few things I want to bring your attention to. We have as you may have seen when you walked in, we have a book giveaway. We are starting to downsize our library in preparation for our renewal projects. I encourage you, if you didn't already, to take a look at the books outside. We have lots of great stuff. And then we have a couple of programs coming up I want to let you know about. On December 18th is going to be our annual Mitzvah Day. And if you don't know about that, I encourage you to take a look online on our website. It's an opportunity where we have lots of volunteer projects. It's a great way to connect with the community here. And we would love for you to sign up now if you haven't already for some of those projects. We also have a special request. This year, one of those projects is a tree gleaning project that's going to be led by David Gaines, the gentleman who just came out from the breakfast crew. So if anyone here has trees, fruit trees, this has been a tougher year for local fruit. We'd love to connect with you if you're open to having our team come out and glean your trees. So please get in touch with David. You can contact him through the temple office. And lastly, I just want to let you know our last Sunday morning live while we're in this location before we leave is going to be January 15th, and we're going to have the world famous Islamic scholar Reza Aslan here, so you don't want to miss that. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to ask Ken Rotman to come up and introduce this morning's speaker. Thanks again.
Good morning, everybody. Out of curiosity, how many how many people are here for the first time for a Sunday Morning Live? All right. As you all know, and for those that haven't been here before, this is really our programming to try to bring thought-provoking, illuminating, sometimes controversial, but hopefully always conversational speakers into our community. And it could not have been done, as Paul had referred to, if it wasn't for Kenny Gaines, in whose memory this program is named, and all of the chefs who you saw. And I normally don't get to say their names, but I want to say them so that if you see them, you can thank them. Doug Weinstein, Jay Farbman, Sebastian Fishman, Dan Haybecker, Elijah Lovejoy, Beverly Breyer, Ross Melkzer, and Natalie Gaines were the chefs. And I thought, and Georgine, my wife, thought the noodle kugel was like the best ever today. Oh my God, okay. So, and I also would like to say that the hour before the speaker here at Sunday Morning Live, this is such a special hour. And I want everybody to know, take advantage of this. There's no praying, there's no Hebrew. You'll sit at a table with people that are, because we're all here, these are the kinds of people we want to be with. And so I just am so excited to imagine all of the wonderful conversations that were going on at these tables. And this is really just an amazing thing that happens in that hour. I want to make one additional announcement about today and tomorrow. There is a program tomorrow at the Federation that is on the same topic that will be taking different angles. And Steve Zipperstein, who is here, and I want to personally thank Steve for having chaired the Sunday Morning Live Committee for much of the last 5 years. And where is Steve? Where are you? Where's your hand somewhere? Thank you for that. And tomorrow, Steve will be moderating a program where Abe Foxman, who was I think the head of the ADL for like 50 years, is going to be speaking. And he came out with an interesting op-ed piece just the other day. And then Evan Goodman, who's one of the leading campus experts on things like anti-Semitism, will be speaking at the Federation Building, 6:30, free light dinner, 7 o'clock, the speakers, down on Chapala Street. And then the last thing I want to say before the actual introduction is that coming up with these speakers isn't necessarily as easy as you think, but sometimes it is when you have people like Ira Udovin in town. And when I came back onto the committee, and others that are on the committee, and when we were doing this program, it was like, well, what do we do here? Well, let's do Israeli elections, easy, professor at the university here. And then anti-Semitism, which was like, is this crazy? What's going on? And the first thing that Ira said, Dan Meisel, he's a great speaker. We're lucky to have him in our community. He's a grand guy. That's how Ira would say, what do you say? He's a grand guy, and that is the truth. And I just want to say that thanks, Ira, and other people that really know things that can do it. And as far as Reza Aslan next month, this is the last thing on that. Reza has had to cancel several of his speaking engagements because of death threats to him and his family, speaking effectively in support of all people seeking democracies. And so we are a private event, and I'm still pretty sure he will be here, but just know that there's a risk that we'll have to have something else happen next month. But that's crazy. So I do have a bio that I'm going to read about Dan, but I personally just want to say that maybe 20 years ago, I went to an ADL event, and I was lucky enough to have spent time with Dan. I just thought this was like a really knowledgeable person that was able to get to the issues and explain them in a logical way. And then as a layperson, he became involved. And now we're just really lucky that he's now professional staff. And I'm going to read a little bit of his bio. He's now in his 4th year serving as regional director of the Santa Barbara Tri-Counties Office of the Anti-Defamation League, which, as you know, is a 110-year-old organization that's trying to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. He previously served as the chair of their regional board. He also chaired local and national ADL committees focusing on narrowing educational achievement and opportunity gaps. His ADL office serves Santa Barbara, Ventura, and San Luis Obispo counties. One of the interesting things in Dan's past is that he is a writer and he's a producer. If anybody has seen All She Can, it premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, was played on HBO. But interestingly, he was a First Amendment and general litigation attorney that he has written opinion pieces and reviews and articles. And obviously today, the issue of First Amendment, free speech, discrimination, it's just an interesting line. And the fact that that's your legal background, I'm just excited to hear what you have to say about it. He served 2 terms on the UC Hastings College of Law's Alumni Board. He's currently serving on the board of the Santa Barbara Education Foundation. He's served on multiple terms on CBB's Board of Trustees, including a term as the CBB Social Action Trustee. A grand guy. Dan, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. We'll try to live up to it. Thank you, Ira, for thinking about me. And thank you to Paul and CBB for inviting me to address you this morning. A little bit, it was not 20 years ago, Ken, that we met. I'm not that old, thankfully, but I'm getting there. It was at least 10. But a little more background on me. I grew up about a quarter mile from here. Went to Foothill School. This is really a walk away, and was here through high school, San Marcos High School, and was bar mitzvahed right over there, and have been a part of this community for quite some time. Was away for a long time after high school, went to law school, spent time in the Bay Area, New York, before coming back here in 2010, when my oldest, Aiden, oldest of 3 boys with 3 kids, was 5 years old. And so it was a return to this community to be able to enable my children to experience much of the experience that I had. And while I was gone, this Dan Meisel right here kind of took my place. In the community, everyone pretty much figured he was me. It was really nice to have kind of doppelganger. And one is particularly as nice as him. People often come up to me and say, I introduce myself and they say, I know Dan Meisel and you're not Dan Meisel. And I'm sure he has something similar happen. So my pathway to ADL, yeah, it's taken some curves. I never expected that I'd be in this place talking about these issues. But I grew up, many of you know Judy Meisel, my aunt, growing up. And so I'd certainly heard about the Holocaust and her harrowing experiences in the Holocaust. It was terrifying to me. I was the only Jewish student at Foothill School every year, and so I was asked to do my Hanukkah presentations every year, but I really didn't experience a lot of anti-Semitism or hostility growing up. Not till I went to college and met someone from Missouri who asked to see my horns. That was really kind of, the first time that I encountered it head on. But not only did I have these kind of horrible fears about the Holocaust, and what it represented to me was this sense of utter powerlessness that people experience. It was really hard for me to process that. But when I got to college, I really was focusing on political economy, philosophy, and what led up to the Holocaust, what happened in Weimar Germany, and the collapse of a democracy, and the fragility of democratic structures. And that is what prompted me to study constitutional law, head to law school, focus on the First Amendment. And while I was doing other things, I didn't love litigation, so I got away from litigation. But I always kept this interest in the social contract, this agreement that we make with other people that protects us all, and how it came to fruition, and how we protect it, and the fragility of it. And so when my first encounter with ADL was the work that ADL was doing in the civil rights arena. And I was proud that it was this organization that stemmed from Jewish values and a Jewish background and a Jewish history to really have a foray into protecting democratic structures, protecting marginalized and minority communities. And I joined with the sense, first as a volunteer, that here's my way to help our country perfect the vision or further the vision that it laid out so many years ago in this social compact that we call the Constitution. I didn't imagine that this short period later, we'd be talking so quickly about the fragility of democratic structures. But we're here, and it's very relevant for what we're talking about today. My plan is I'm trying something a little new. Normally when I would come and do a presentation, I would do it with a PowerPoint. It would be on a particular issue within the anti-Semitism landscape. I would have facts, figures, particular examples, and we'd really work from the specific to the general. But I'm going to try something different. First of all, because I'm tired of looking at screens. This is Sunday morning live. We're going to have a conversation. And we're just going to be face-to-face, which is, I think, conduct that we need to model now because the screens are getting in the way of personal cues and facial cues and things that we need to communicate more effectively. But also because I'm trying something different, which is today I'm going to go from the general to the specific. And I'm doing it because when people come to me so often, they're doing so in response to a particular incident or a few different incidents. And they're having trouble making sense of what connects these. And it's because these incidents are occurring in a different part of the anti-Semitism landscape. And we need to understand the context of each of these incidents to understand effective response to them. It's a very complicated landscape. And being asked to come talk about anti-Semitism is kind of like being asked to come talk about the ocean. There are so many different ways that I could come into the ocean. There's so many ways that I could come into anti-Semitism. So what I'm going to try to do, here's my plan, is that I'm going to cover 4 basic points, and then I'm going to hop up to about a 10,000-foot view of the anti-Semitism landscape in the US. Then I'm going to mention some aggravating factors, some solutions or ways of addressing this, and then some personal actions that we all can take. And then I want to open up to questions. And so I want to leave a significant amount of time for questions because it's in the conversation that we're going to get to the specific. Because you're going to ask me about a bunch of specific things, whether it's Kanye or Berkeley Law School. And now I'm going to be able to refer to the landscape that I laid out in response to those specific things. So have those questions, hold them, and know that when I'm talking about one side of the landscape or one part of the landscape, have some patience. I'm going to get to other parts of the landscape. And if I've missed parts of that landscape, I'm going to welcome you to bring them up. Paul, I'm just going to ask you to give me a hands up when we're at about 10:20 if we get there. So I have a sense of time. I didn't bring my phones up with. All right, so the 4 basic points. First one, really basic. What happened to the hyphen in anti-Semitism? I get asked this, how do we even write it? Well, anti-Semitism for quite some time had this hyphen in it. ADL, other organizations, style guides realized that Semitism is not a word in and of itself and didn't want to suggest that Semitism is a word within itself. So we no longer use the hyphen. New York Times doesn't use a hyphen anymore. This has only happened within the last about 4 years. So this is an intentional decision. I don't have time to go back into the whole history of the word Semitism, but just wanted you to know that that's why we're not using the hyphen. Second point. Anti-Semitism is the only form of bigotry that has this duality. Not only are Jews viewed as inferior, but they are also viewed as all-powerful. Inferior and all-powerful. I've known that for a long time, but not until I'm in this position did I really realize the impact of that duality. And we're going to talk about that duality in a moment, or in greater detail. But where does this, and by the way, it's an interesting thing also to be asked to talk about anti-Semitism to an audience that is predominantly Jewish, because so many of you are experts about anti-Semitism. So I know I'm going to be saying some things you already know. I'm going to try to dig a little deeper as to their significance. So this duality, where does it come from? Well, it could come from the myth of deicide. That the Jews committed deicide. It might reach beyond that. It might go further back. The Jews were the first, or among the first monotheistic people. So if you're monotheistic, you're saying, I don't believe in the rest of these gods that everyone has faith in, and yet we survived. So if we survived while dissing everybody else's gods, we must have some protection. And then later, this myth that Jews killed Jesus, if we could kill a representation of God, we must be able to be as powerful as to control the weather or markets or vaccines, anything. So that's kind of the sources that we've seen over time. We've seen this play out. The element of inferiority is myth. Bigotries are based on myths. The myth of inferiority. But the element of all powerfulness is conspiracy theory. And that's what separates anti-Semitism from so many other forms of bigotry, is conspiracy theory. So when conspiracy theories are flourishing generally, we tend to see a rise in anti-Semitism because you have a populace that is more susceptible to conspiracy theories for whatever reason. When you have distrust in the institutions of society, you see anti-Semitism increase, and you see conspiracy theories increase. So that's a through theme through what I'm going to be talking about today, is the distance that we've gotten from fact and the role that that plays in rising anti-Semitism. The third thing that I want to mention, third basic fact, is anti-Semitism rising, or is it just being more reported? I think the data says that anti-Semitism is rising. There's a lot of discussion to take place in terms of, is it attitudes? Is it actions? You know, we've done studies, ADL and others have done studies for many years about anti-Semitic attitudes. And back, 50 years ago, anti-Semitism was kind of its own thing as an attitude. But in more recent history, it's been grouped in with all other kinds of bigotries. People that tended to be racist also tended to be anti-Semitic, with some exceptions. There's these unique elements to attitudes about Jews being loyal more to Israel than to the US. That's sentiment that has kind of prevailed over time and only increased in recent times. But if I were showing you graphs, I'd be showing you the upward trend, dramatic upward trend of anti-Semitic incidents, of anti-Semitic hate crimes, of anti-Semitic proliferation of anti-Semitic flyering. And sadly, you all are aware of a rise in anti-Semitic violence. And this is all just in the US. So yes, we are experiencing a rise in anti-Semitism. We're experiencing a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism. But the anti-Semitism that we're talking about, to put it in historical context, in my lifetime, I'm 53, early in my lifetime, anti-Semitism was, in many places, by law or by policy, right? You can't buy a home in this community. Hope Ranch, at some point in its CCNRs, had various provisions that made it difficult for Jews to buy a home in Hope Ranch. And other places around the country, Minnesota, had laws, or had policies, and there were some laws on the books that were just outright discrimination. What we're talking about today is not really de jure discrimination against Jews. There are many protections against discrimination, in employment matters or other respects. We're talking about de facto discrimination. In the same way that with respect to racism, many of the de jure, by law racism that used to exist has been dealt with at a legislative level. But what we're dealing with today is de facto segregation, de facto racism in fact. The fifth element that I want to talk about is that, or the fourth basic fact is just that, how do you dissipate conspiracy theories? You do it with truth. So title of the talk, Fighting Anti-Semitism Through Truth. We're going to be talking about how you get to the truth. And then I'll just add that in some cases you also need empathy. Truth alone is not enough. We may also need to teach empathy, people caring about the truth and the importance of how it affects our interpersonal relations. All right, so I'm going to jump now into the second phase. I'm going to talk at 10,000 feet level, talking about the current landscape of anti-Semitism. And I don't love these terms left and right. I don't think they really explain the whole landscape. But just for the purposes of how I need to be general today, I'm going to use that framework of left and right. So the reason that we're experiencing so much confusion, if we're kind of in the center, mainstream, we consider ourselves in the mainstream, is that we're seeing anti-Semitism on extreme right, and we're seeing anti-Semitism on extreme left, and both are being normalized. They both are moving towards the experience of the mainstream. So if you're in the mainstream, you're seeing it from both sides. And coming back to this point about the power of the conspiracy theory of power, both, is that it lends itself to the narrative of emancipation, which is a very powerful narrative to support any kind of advocacy. If you're being oppressed, the way to get out of oppression is to free yourself. If there's a power, you need to free yourself from the power. We're seeing that element play both on the right and on the left. It's not equivalent in many ways, it's different, but let's go through them. So on the far right, I'm talking about far right extremist groups, the groups that we often think of as neo-Nazis. They're not all neo-Nazis. Some are white supremacists or white nationalists without affiliation to Nazi groups. These groups believe in white supremacy or white nationalism. White supremacy is an interesting distinction. White supremacy means we think whites are better than all people, and we think we can define what white is and enforce that. And white nationalism was like a political shift for that group, for those groups. They thought more politically palatable, is to say, no, it's not that we're superior, it's that we have the right to live separately from everyone else, and we were here first, which is factually not correct. But even if they're saying we're not here first, they're saying we were here en masse first, we have the power, everyone else has no right to be here. So that's kind of the first element of the far-right ideology. What few people understand is that anti-Semitism is at the core of white supremacist ideology. How is that the case? Why were 200 people walking in Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us," when their real effort is white supremacy? Well, they weren't saying, for those of you who haven't kind of delved down this rabbit hole, they weren't saying that Jews in number, or we're going to replace us with a bunch of Jews. That's not what they were saying. Their ideology is that non-white races are so inferior and so incapable of accomplishing achievement that the only way that they've gotten ahead in our society, and they've even come to our society, is because somebody else smart and powerful brought them. And so the concept of the white supremacists is that Jews are responsible. Jews have this worldwide agenda of global domination to serve their own purposes, and they are the ones responsible for the rise of people of color to help them overthrow or control government. So Jews will not replace us. They're pointing to a small group of Jews that they are saying are all powerful and are responsible for immigration, responsible for the Civil Rights Act, Civil Rights Movement, responsible for people of color in higher education. The list goes on and on. So that's an important element to their philosophy. How has that been normalized? Replacement theory. The concept of replacement theory, that the white voting populace of our country is being replaced. Notice the passive tense there. So the normalized view, the extremist view would say Jews are replacing. But the normalized view is simply to say, passive tense, this white populace is being replaced by immigrants, people of color. And this is why ADL has been so outspoken about Tucker Carlson and others that are espousing replacement theory with huge platforms. Another element of the far right is to attack the institutions of democracy that aren't working well for them, right? They're losing elections. For many years, the Supreme Court was taking the country in a direction that they were very uncomfortable with, they were fearful about. So, and the democratic trends are not in their favor. And so their view is this government that was set up is no longer legitimate. It's no longer legitimately representing us as a people. And so we have to fight against the government. And part of their philosophy is to incite violence as a part of undermining our government structures. Well, how has this been normalized? You see it obviously in this concept of stolen elections, right? You see it in political advertising that was sadly quite prominent in the South, where a candidate that was a Jewish candidate, we saw their photographs were actually altered to extend their nose. There was allegations that a Jewish candidate or just a Democratic candidate was a George Soros funded candidate, back hearkening to this concept of the Jewish cabal that is behind any kind of political value that is not their own. So we saw that moving to the center. And then this concept about inciting violence. What are they turning to actually incite violence? Well, two things. One is we've seen this surge recently of reference to pedophilia. is that we're calling LGBTQ community pedophiles, and then anybody who supports them are pedophiles. And we see this in these QAnon conspiracy theories about Pizzagate, what's happening in the non-existent basement of a pizza place, in a small town. What is more vile? What more would incite us to action than some fear of ours that somebody, or belief that somebody is committing pedophilia, attacking our kids? The other incitement to violence has to do with, are there grounds for insurrection? When could we argue that there are grounds and convince people there are grounds for insurrection? And that was the emanation of this, of the election is stolen. And we need to go to Washington because then President Trump is going to invoke this legislative action that says that this is, the sedition is occurring. And then now we need to rise up, as the Constitution allows us to do, as militias to protect the government. This is a patriotic, something they postulate as a patriotic belief into action. How are we seeing this normalized? There are some very frightening studies coming out. UC Davis did one, University of Chicago did one, with a set of questions around how many people feel, and to what extent do you feel, that violence is justified to support your political views or your way of life? And these numbers are coming back at 10% of the population, 10% of the adult voting population, 20 million people. That's frightening. On the replacement theory, or not replacement theory, but on the stop the steal, the surveys are going out about how many people feel that the last election, presidential election, was illegitimate, that it didn't represent what actually occurred. Those same surveys are saying about 19% of the voting electorate. That's 50 million people. That's normalization. That's not an extreme wing. All right, let's jump to the other side. The narrative on the right was we need to attack institutions that are illegitimate. Narrative on the left, far left, is that government and other establishment institutions represent or support structural racism, structural oppression, or structural oppression in other forms. And so the narrative on the left is that there's another reason to distrust our institutions, and that the path to addressing those problems is to deconstruct those institutions. So again, we have a different theory of emancipation that is playing out in a different way. How does it play out? Well, Jews are in control of banking. How does it manifest itself in terms of anti-Semitism? These myths, conspiracy theories, the Jews are head of banking, the Jews control Hollywood, the Jews control healthcare, and then there's Israel, and I'll get to Israel in a second. I'm not saying that the left is anti-Semitic. I'm not saying that the right, the far right, all of the far right is anti-Semitic. I'm talking about where anti-Semitism exists from those elements. This is what it looks like. This is how it manifests. And we don't talk in terms of left anti-Semitism and right anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is just anti-Semitism. They're doing the same thing. They're using the myths, the conspiracy theory of anti-Semitism to fit their narrative. And that's what's so insidious about this all-powerful element of anti-Semitism, is that it's so easy from wherever you are on a political spectrum, or whatever objective or agenda you have, to point to the all-powerfulness when you're talking about a very small group of people that few people understand and really don't have the platforms in some ways to defend themselves. It's a convenient target to use for that purpose. Okay, so how does the left moving towards this normalization? Well, many of you experience it. Kanye does not fit in the left. He doesn't fit anywhere. I'll come to that if we ask. I wouldn't point to him. But this concept of Jews controlling Hollywood existed before Kanye. It's not left or right, but you often hear it from what people that consider themselves part of the left. Most of us are experiencing it in terms of a conversation about Israel. And most of our children are experiencing it if they're at a college campus in the context of Israel. This is a whole other topic that I could do separate talks on, and there are people that are much more knowledgeable historically about, some of them are in this room, about the history of Israel. But I just want to touch on a couple points. So if you're concerned about white supremacy, if you're concerned about a patriarchal government, if you're concerned about oppression, it's very easy to look at things that are going on in Israel and think that you see that, or see elements of it there and want to respond to it. The criticism of Israel, however, comes from many different sources. It doesn't just come from the left. So when a caravan of pro-Palestinians or Palestinian Americans went through Beverly Hills back during the flare-up with Gaza, and they were looking for Jews to have encounters with, I wouldn't say that they're the left. They don't represent the left. They represent nationalism. So a good part of the anti-Israel criticism, anti-Zionist movement are not coming from a political perspective. They are coming from a nationalist, a geopolitical perspective. But their tactics in how to accomplish change in Israel, the tactic of establishing illegality and engaging in rhetoric to amp up a sense of injustice, disjustice, and need for violent response is what we see moving towards the mainstream. And so the conversations, you see some of this rhetoric is rhetoric, use of apartheid. Now this is can be a very in-depth conversation about the use of the term apartheid with respect to Israel. But there's some people that are using the term and explaining all the academic reasons why they think it applies. But most people who hear that term are not engaging in that conversation. They're just triggering a response to what apartheid meant in a different context, and they're outraged by it and move to action without investigating it further. But the equivalent, I would say, to the pedophile claim that we're hearing from the right to incite people to violence, what we're hearing on the left is genocide. What's going on in Israel is racially motivated genocide. What more to incite us to action? And when we saw, and when I say us, I mean kind of the mainstream. And what we saw is when the confrontation in Gaza was occurring and the missiles were flying, rockets were flying last May, is we saw a typical bump in anti-Semitic incidents. What was new was the level of violence that we saw in anti-Semitic incidents. There was a 150% increase in anti-Semitic incidents generally in our counting, and that's not incidents where people are criticizing Israel. That's incidents where people are hostile to Jews because of their Jewish identity in response to what's happening in Israel. But since then, we have seen a large rise in actual violence against Jewish victims for being Jewish. Okay. So that's the landscape. If you're on one end of the landscape, you probably aren't all that aware or critical of how anti-Semitism is manifesting itself in your arena. You're seeing it from the other. You're seeing the other side doing it. And if you're in the far end of the other side, you're really focused on what you're seeing on the other end. The problem is if you're in the middle, you're seeing it from both directions, and you're thinking, "Oh my gosh, there's anti-Semitism everywhere. It's all around me." And one of the reasons you're seeing it is because both sides have calculated that you are the battleground in the middle. It's not worth them strategically. It's not worth them spending their time on the other side, the far other side. It's focusing on the mainstream to convince mainstream to join where you are. All right. So moving on to aggravating factors. I think these are really important. So one, political division. Clearly, political division and zero-sum tactics, right? It has meant this political division that we've experienced, maybe it started with Newt Gingrich, that's another whole conversation, but this idea that we cannot compromise our values, we must just go full bore and use the system to accomplish the power we need to accomplish the results we want. This has permeated our life. And one of the main ways it's permeated our lives is in how we get news, how we get facts. And we need these facts to know truth. So you may recall Wanda Sykes, comedian, got into trouble at she raised a bunch of controversy at the White House press correspondents dinner because she said some things about Rush Limbaugh. There was a conversation about whether that was over the top. What I remember from that dinner is she made this joke. She said, CNN, you love breaking news. Well, congratulations, you've broken it. And I think she's right. I think when we moved from news hour from 5 to 6 p.m. or 8 to 9 p.m. to a round-the-clock news hour, there wasn't enough ability of these organizations to fill 24 hours with news, and so they filled it with commentary. And that's when our news stations divided, and suddenly we are getting predominantly commentary and not news. So we gravitate to the commentary that we appreciate, and we no longer watch the other. Then the internet came. Aggravating factor number 2, social media platforms. So now there's this massive proliferation in where we get our information. And not only can we just go to the places that are from agreeable sources or sources that feel agreeable, but these platforms are now going to amplify what we're seeing and draw us farther and farther in, not because they're interested in what we care about, they're agnostic about what we care about, they're designed to make money for the social media platform. And when these social media platforms came up, we gave them legal immunity from liability for misinformation and defamation. And we did that because at the time they said, we're not editors, we're not like the New York Times, we're not looking at this content and changing the content or producing our own. We're just the public bulletin board. We just build the bulletin board and everyone puts their comments up and they need to be responsible for what they put up. Well, that's not true, because the way that their algorithms work, algorithms are just formulas that are built into software code, is the algorithms are designed to maximize eyes on content. And so when you do a search, oh, I'm interested, what is Pizzagate? Somebody told me about Pizzagate. I search Pizzagate. Now the algorithm makes my news page different from anybody else's, and it starts inviting me to all these other conversations about those issues. So we say, in response to an incident of hate, you need a combination of communal condemnation and you need engagement to address these false beliefs, right? And the more diverse the condemnation, the better. The more in-depth the engagement, the better. On social media platforms, you're getting the exact opposite. When there's an incident of hate, it is amplified, and then it is condoned. More people are invited to it, and people are in more and more isolated echo chambers online. They are not experiencing no exchange of information. We're operating on different facts. Very bad if you're trying to address conspiracy theories and operate from similar truth. Huge aggravating factor. Quick ones. The difference between, we've lost this sense of a difference between what is rhetoric and what is advocacy based on fact. We've become very good at constructing arguments and very bad at realizing when we shouldn't be making an argument, but really should be trying to investigate what the real situation is. And we are letting our views color our outcomes. In other words, we have an outcome we want to get to, and so we start cherry picking facts to fit that outcome, rather than holding back, getting the facts, and letting the facts lead us to an outcome. Okay, so those are the aggravating factors. Did I miss anything? Oh, the pandemic obviously isolated us again, exacerbated the problem of social media, where a lot of us spend our time. And then I'll throw a couple more in: the under-resourcing of education and mental wellness resources, mental wellness services. And so we're getting less quality education, we're getting less services that we need for mental health issues, increase in fear-mongering generally, and the weaponizing of ambiguity. This is an interesting one. We're a 501c3, we don't endorse candidates or not, but it's worth noting how good President Trump is in weaponizing ambiguity. And the way he does it is he says, they stole the election, and then never says who they is. They did this, they did that. And then when people attack him for the they, he then becomes the victim. Oh, well, all I said was, I didn't accuse this person, I didn't accuse this person. And then they gain sympathy for being attacked when they've thrown out something ambiguous and everyone attacks them for being ambiguous. Quick answer to that is you don't get a pass for being ambiguous anymore, particularly on issues that threaten communities in the country. You should not get that pass. that it's okay for us to assume, let's start assuming the worst, and you need to, if you're going to weigh into a situation that's a volatile issue, then you need to be more specific. You can't say DEFCON 3 to Jewish people, and for us to think, oh, maybe he's just going to, talk about some criticisms he has tomorrow. You can't do that. All right, so moving on to solutions. And I'll throw one more aggravating factor in there is accessibility of weapons in terms of how that has impacted people's actions. I don't want to dwell on that, but that's certainly an exacerbating factor for the violence that we have seen on big scale. Okay, so solutions. What's my time? 10:30, all right. Love leaving 2 minutes for solutions, but I'm gonna jump through here quickly. Solution number one, we need to resist all forms of bigotry, not just anti-Semitism, because these are all connected. The problems that are happening with our students in schools, if they're uttering a racial slur, which is a particular problem locally, or they're uttering an anti-Semitic slur or an anti-LGBTQ slur, it's coming from a similar place of ignorance. So how do we protect against anti-Semitism? We try to address responsibly and in every way we can any form of myth as it occurs in bigotry. Second, we need to debunk and pre-bunk conspiracy theories. How do you debunk them? Start spreading truth in response. Somebody spreads a conspiracy theory and you say, I know that's not true. Here is the actual information. How do you pre-bunk it? You improve our critical thinking and the way that we see facts coming in and can spot an agenda, right? We need to train our kids how to interact with information and sources as they come in now that there's this mass proliferation of sources. And we need to change the way we get information. If I want to see information from the left and the right, I do a Google alert, for ADL, just ADL. And then I'm not getting just favorable things about ADL, I'm getting horrible things about ADL, I'm getting supportive things about ADL, I'm seeing things from all sides. I pick a couple papers from, a couple websites from both sides of the spectrum to read, or all sides of the spectrum. I can barely keep up with kind of all the different sources out there, but I try, because the more sources that I can source my information from, then the better chance I have of ferreting out truth. We clearly need to counter extremists. We need to do that tactically and with policy. We need to reform Section 230, which gives the immunity from liability for social media platforms. How do we reform it? Well, I can't get ahead of ADL on it. They'll come out with a proposal relatively soon, I think. But if I were to fathom if I were to hone in on the issue, is any content that a social media platform touches with its algorithms, perhaps we should be removed from the limitation of liability that they have. So either they remove all their algorithms, or when their algorithms are working on content, they no longer are viewed as a bulletin board, they are now viewed as an editor, publisher. That's where I think this conversation may go. It already has started moving in that direction, and I think we'll see it move in that direction further. I'm going to just mention a few things that we can do. I've already mentioned kind of where I see generally the solutions are, but in terms of how we conduct ourselves in conversations, I want to point you to, there was an article I wrote for Montecito Journal, I think it was about 6 months ago, that just talked about how some tips for engaging in conversation with people with whom you disagree, and some mistakes that we make that closes off conversation and doesn't get to the meat of the issue. And one key one in there that I've talked about often, I really do think this makes a difference, is that in engaging in somebody that disagrees with you, don't ask them their opinion. If you ask them their opinion, they're going to tell you their conclusions, and you don't get to hear all the things that underlie the conclusions. If you ask instead, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about gun violence? How do you feel about ethnic studies? What you get instead is a conversation about their fears, right? I feel this way because I had this thing happen to me, and that led me to have these fears. And you see then the building blocks that lead to the opinion. And that is the ripe area for conversation, because many of those building blocks you can probably identify with. You can talk about fear and fears that you've had. So that's just one that really kind of stuck out for me. And then I just wanted to give I'm going to give a very quick overview of how does the organization that views itself as a leading organization in the world with respect to anti-Semitism address this massive landscape that I've just described. There is no three-point solution to addressing anti-Semitism. So we have a center on extremism that focuses on extremist groups. We have a government arm, government relations arm, that focuses on lobbying for legislative response to these issues. We have an education arm that does anti-bias education in schools and for workplaces. And then we have a separate education arm that focuses on just on anti-Semitism, educating communities about anti-Semitism. And we have a government relations, we have an international relations team that is focused on Israel and messaging around Israel. So we have 425 employees that have spanned into really complex groupings of teams, because the only way to address all of this is to address every part of the landscape together. If you're missing a part of this landscape, then you're letting it foment and build in that area, and it undermines the work you're trying to do everywhere else. I had some other thoughts to say. I'm going to stop there because I think they'll come out in answering some questions, but I want to give you a chance to ask what you'd like to ask, and we'll continue the conversation that way.
We have a mic, so we're a very busy room. I'll pass this around if folks have questions.
Yeah, and I want to have discussion, but I know that there may be a lot of questions, so the best way to get to a lot of people's concerns is to just keep your questions kind of brief, so that rather than long comments. I see a hand over here. Yeah.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I don't think I heard you mention critical race theory. Could you briefly mention, tell us how that, what's its relationship to anti-Semitism?
Sure. So critical race theory is a discipline really at the collegiate level that focuses on the impact of race in our institutional structures. It is kind of a higher level discipline. Where people are concerned about it most is application of that to a younger audience. And so where the conversation has occurred is, how is this higher level discussion of oppression and structures of oppression coming down to a conversation of ethnic studies that is now mandated in our high school audience? And I think the way to think about this is that ethnic studies, capital E, capital S, that is occurring at colleges around the country and has a long time, usually apart from religious studies. And so, there may be schools that have departments of religious studies, and within it they have Jewish studies, and then the ethnic studies might be a completely different department. That capital E and S is not how we need to think about ethnic studies at the high school level. It's a different audience and a different conversation when you're introducing people to these concepts. So there may be elements of critical race theory that are part of the conversation of critical race theory that can be addressed at the high school level, but our approach needs to be different. And part of the reason the approach is different is that college kids they have a better, more highly developed understanding of when indoctrination is occurring. High school students do not. We want high school students to be making up their own minds about these issues and talking to people about them to explore them further. So there is a great article by Bill Honig, who was the former superintendent of education for the state of California, where he lays out a description of inclusive ethnic studies. And if you Google Bill Honig and ethnic studies, you'll find it right away. And what I love about it is that his definition of inclusive ethnic studies is to keep the individual primary, to not look at ethnic studies through the lens of group identity. Understand that an individual may have many group identities. Prioritize the individual identity and then bring in the influence of group identity. And I think it's a wonderful way in. Now, I think we're going to, there were all kinds of problems with the model curriculum that first came out at the state level, because those that were employed or selected to draft it had a very specific agenda about Israel that made it into their materials. And so there was a lot of objection about that. Now that's been excised, but that group of authors is out pitching themselves as consultants to individual districts to help design their ethnic studies programs and to train their teachers. So we need to be vigilant about how our school districts are approaching the concept of ethnic studies. And there are some that are doing it very well and in a very inclusive way. Just to point out one, Ventura Unified and Santa Barbara Unified were both kind of ahead of the pack in developing ethnic studies programs before there was a state mandate or model curriculum. And the Ventura Unified approach was to have presentations from all these different ethnic groups open to the public. And they did a whole session on Judaism. What is Judaism? And I think this, I didn't get to this, but this concept of what is Judaism is so important, does not exist in our high school curriculum, unless you're at a private school that is a Jewish private school. We brought a speaker up from Project Shema, who talked about this in a wonderful way. And so he was focusing on kind of the liberal critique of Israel. His point is, there is a lack of understanding in our country of what is Judaism. And if you don't understand what is Judaism, then you cannot understand what is anti-Semitism. The vast majority of anti-Semitism has nothing to do with, and this is coming back to your point about ethnic studies, how it dovetails to anti-Semitism. The vast majority of anti-Semitism doesn't have to do about religious practice or ritual. It has to do with other elements that we associate with Jewish experience. So it's too easy for somebody to say, if I'm not criticizing the Jewish religion, how could I be being anti-Semitic? Well, all these myths that are around anti-Semitism have to do with the Jewish American experience. Jews are more than just a religion. They're an ethnicity, they're a culture, they have a connection, historical connection to land, that at different times have been a nation. So these are, we need to educate people about what anti-Semitism is, whether Judaism is, and then how it manifests as anti-Semitism. Two things that we have difficulty addressing from the left is that number one is that a large part of our population is white or passes as white. And so in the circles that are focused on oppression as it relates to race, they exclude us from the conversation because they say oppression, white people are just not oppressed. Well, first of all, I want to point out there are Jews of color. So when they say, well, there's no place for Jews in the conversation, they're wrong on that first element if they're focused on race. But what they also lack in that analysis of limiting conversation about oppression to race is that they lack this sense of fragility of privilege that Jews have. The Jews that pass as white, yes, we may have experienced times of influence and power and safety. But if you look at the course of history, our experience of privilege does not look like this. It's not a slow line moving up, as you might see for other minority groups. Our history is this, that we go through periods of a lot of privilege and then it just disappears and it drops fast. And that privilege can also drop between a Jewish person that's walking along the street that looks like me and a Jewish person walking along the street that has a yarmulke. As soon as there's some indication or Jewish name of Jewish identity, our privilege drops off dramatically. So one conversation is expanding this definition of oppression, which I think is a very useful concept that we understand very well, to incorporate the experience of groups that are not just groups of color. The other thing is that there is a distrust at times from people of color to a Jewish perspective because of proximity to privilege. They say, oh, well, if you have some proximity to privilege, you don't have anything to add to our conversation. So again, we need to educate about what Judaism is, what the experience is, and how it's manifested itself as anti-Semitism.
Two quick questions, one simple, the other not. The first question, there's been clear evidence establishing that Russia has used its cyber capabilities to interfere with our elections. Is there any evidence to indicate that it's also propagating anti-Semitism in our country to further polarization and that country's own political goals? Secondly, my question is, while ADL and others 3 years ago took the hyphen out of anti-Semitism to perhaps refine that definition, how does ADL now define an anti-Semite? Is it a person who simply repeats the tropes and speaks in a prejudiced way, as we're often hearing? Because I find it to be incongruous to have somebody speak those things, but somebody say, oh, I don't think he or she is an anti-Semite?
Thank you for those questions. So yes, the first question, is there evidence of Russia using social media platforms or other kind of cyber threats to increase anti-Semitism or to foment anti-Semitism in the US? You know, I have, this is one of those presentations that I usually do with examples. I think there was in the, boy, this was the run-up. So this is the first election involving Trump. So the Clinton-Trump election, there were so many political ads that were utilizing Facebook that had foreign sources. And I think some of those ads were racially motivated. They were kind of religiously tinged, and there were George Soros reference. I mean, there was that structuring of that. And I can't recall if we put a number or a percentage, but I seem to recall that there was some element of that. I think where we're seeing it now is more with respect to what's happening into Ukraine. So there was a conspiracy theorist, a member of a kind of extremist group online, who just invented this theory that Russia was attacking Ukraine because the U.S. had put biolabs in Ukraine. And I think there was some sense of it was kind of like, you know, Jewish-funded, you know, things that the U.S. was doing in Ukraine. Now, you can search this and check me on this. I'm not positive that there was a Jewish element to it. But this is an example of kind of how these conspiracy theories pick up, is that this guy just makes this up out of whole cloth. And then the first person to magnify it is Russia. And then they had their embassy in, I can't remember which country it was, Bulgaria or something, it was somebody nearby. They amplified this conspiracy theory, and then you just see it take off. And ADL was actually the group that identified who created this conspiracy theory and tracked it back to him and debunked it. So I can't give you the hard facts on what was definitely tied to Russia. I don't even know if Facebook can. But I suspect that was part of what they were doing, not particularly to be anti-Semitic, but to foment unrest. Russia's focus is to destabilize our democracy. So fomenting anti-Semitism, any conspiracy theories, racism, it all serves to destabilize, and so is in their interest to do so. Second question about anti-Semite, ADL's approach is rarely to label somebody as an anti-Semite, which suggests that they're kind of irreparably in this camp. You know, ADL's approach is to focus on anti-Semitic conduct, anti-Semitic expression, and only in these cases where somebody is incorrigibly engaged in that kind of conduct would ADL use that language. So even somebody that is, well, I won't give particular examples, but there are a lot of prominent political figures that are criticizing Israel and using the word genocide. In response to those individuals, ADL will call that out as anti-Semitic expression, and they'll explain why, but they tend not to refer to that person as an anti-Semite. There are several prominent exceptions. Farrakhan has earned that label from ADL as anti-Semite, and it looks like Kanye. I mean, I think I've seen us actually just recently in response to Kanye's recent or Ye's recent postings and content. I've seen that label come out, but it's very rare for them to put somebody in a camp that seems irreversible. I see a question in the back and one in the front. Two in the front.
So in this time of increasing anti-Semitic action, what do we tell our children? What do we tell our children so that they can continue to identify as Jews, to be proud of their Jewish identity, and to be active in their support of the Jewish community?
That's a great place to focus. It is, in many ways, kind of a bright spot in our society that our children today are in many ways more open and accepting of variety and diversity than my generation and older. So I have a lot of hope. You know, that gives me a lot of hope for our future. I think the important thing to tell your kids, and mine are sitting over there, is you are, you know, the society is going to view you as Jewish whether or not you choose to affiliate. And so, and again, the label of the definition of Judaism goes so far beyond just religious practice, that understanding, we need to educate our kids about what is the landscape of Judaism that they are a part of. And we need to equip them to recognize anti-Semitism when it's occurring, to be able to respond to it, to be able to build allyship, and to participate in allyship. And so having conversations when there's an incident in your school that is an incident that doesn't involve anti-Semitism, but it involves bullying, or it involves use of a racial slur, having those conversations with our children about why that is problematic and the connection between that kind of action and anti-Semitism is really important to build into their experience. There have been, Carrie Tobes and Rob Skinner both had really nice letters to the editor in the Newshawk yesterday about this rash of recent incidents that have been reported, anti-Black incidents in our Goleta district and the Santa Barbara district. And it's really important that the schools respond to these incidents appropriately, responsibly, and with resources, all the resources that are needed from an anti-bias perspective, from a mental wellness perspective. But why would we expect our schools to have all of this responsibility? Many of these students are hearing this language at home. And so how can we emphasize the responsibility of parents to be having these conversations at home and to take on responsibility for educating their kids about these issues? I think we need to do more thinking and action about that. And that might mean a collective letter to the editor that is not directed to the schools, but is directed to parents in our community, to say, what conversations are you having? And ADL, by the way, has a ton of resources. It has this thing that calls Table Talks. And then we keep publishing on our website new Table Talks in response to daily events, current events, that are just suited so that parents can have conversations with their kids around the dinner table. Hopefully they're still having conversations with their kids around the dinner table, and raise these issues, and it prompts some questions that prompt good conversations. Thank you for that question.
There were some questions in the front, you said.
I saw one, yes.
You mentioned,
There's a mic for you. Yeah.
you mentioned myth, and I think there's a big distinction between myth and fallacy. And I think that we misuse the word myth when we're talking about, that's just not right. It's not correct. It's a fallacy. And you made it up. Doesn't make it a myth.
Yeah.
And the other side, the other question, or the first question I have to ask is, how do we, I didn't hear you talk about religious divisions in anti-Semitism and how there is a movement in evangelism and all of these things. Where do we go with that?
You're right, more of the landscape that we didn't cover. So I appreciate the comment about myth. The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell is one of my favorite books. And you're right, I'm doing a disservice to the word myth to use it in this way. And this is, I didn't mention that one of the aggravating factors here is the imprecision of our language. We just often don't have enough words or the ability to pick the right precise word. And I think this is something extremely important. So I appreciate you bringing up the point. Political correctness, horrible term for what political correctness represented. Sensitivity and empathy is what political correctness was about. So these terms that we choose, often for advocacy, not really in the case of myth, but again, rhetoric versus truly accurately representation. I appreciate the correction, and I think that is modeling what we need to do in all these conversations. When you hear somebody use a word that has different meanings, to say, let's focus on the meaning that's relevant for this conversation. The religious divisions, yes, so there used to be a lot more anti-Semitism in the ideology of the Catholic Church, for instance, and over the years, that has really mitigated quite a bit. So, and part of that comes from the Pope, and the papal office has issued some proclamations that, Jews did not kill Jesus, these are our ancestors. But there certainly are still different religions that maybe are kind of emanating, they're fomenting anti-Semitism from the text as they see it. And so there actually is a talk that we give that identifies kind of some of the liturgical, the text sources that are used to foment anti-Semitism. And our message is, you need to defang these terms. This is not really what they meant. This is the way you're interpreting it is problematic for these reasons. So yeah, interfaith relations, conversations is a whole nother realm that needs to occur to address these issues. There was one period where we developed an education program just designed for members of the Catholic Church to talk about those issues, that the fallacies that were coming up within the teaching of Catholic Church. But it still exists, and the best thing I can say is report it when you experience. Now, I did get an email recently from a student who was at a Christian private school, and at the Christian private school's chapel, there was a presentation about Passover. And the presentation about Passover was given by a Messianic rabbi. And so it presented Passover in this context of Christianity. And the student wrote a very well-reasoned email to the headmaster to say this was an opportunity to bring in somebody from Jewish faith to describe the Jewish experience of Passover and to educate these Christian students that I'm here loving being with at this school about my background. And the response from the headmaster is, our mission is not to teach comparative religions. We are a Christian school. So what we're teaching is our values and our perception, and you can seek that outside, but we love having you here. Is that discrimination? No, it's a Christian school. If that's the way they want to go, it's unfortunate, but it's not legally actionable, I wouldn't say. I can't give legal advice, but that's a conversation that the student hopefully will keep pressing, and maybe they'll change their mind to seeing some benefit to comparative religion within their curriculum. Where's the mic? Is
right here.
Back in the back. Okay.
I think we can all agree that there's a substantial disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And I wonder to what extent that's affected the rise of anti-Semitism. Question one. Question two, to what extent do you think that the Charlottesville incident helped normalize anti-Semitism and give a lot of people the opportunity to think that their positions were acceptable?
Okay, point one was, I'm sorry, could you remind me of point one was? Okay, economic disparity, thank you. That's another aggravating factor. I had it on here, didn't mention it. We do have slides that show the vast economic wealth disparity. How does that play in? Well, that plays into these beliefs, which are true. This is truth, that our system is not structured to come out with an equitable outcome in many respects. And so, yes, our system, there's some great graphs about how wealth has occurred, like within communities of color versus white communities, and that gap has exacerbated over time. It hasn't closed as communities of color have had access to higher education and more positions of influence and political positions as well. So it's super concerning because it supports this narrative that the structures of our society have inequality embedded in them, and we need to address that. Now, if you go to a line of the way to address it is destruction of that institution or distrust of that institution, then there's a move to tactics. Okay, who do we blame? How do we accomplish this? And we see anti-Semitism creep up. But if the response instead is, we need to reform our structures, let's keep the structures we have. Law enforcement, right? You can feel that law enforcement is both essential and supportive of community and also has embedded racism in it. Those aren't inconsistent beliefs. The answer, it doesn't have to be to abolish law enforcement, but there should be a serious look at how do we keep the institution, if we're going to keep it, and reform it to address these issues. And so I think when we jump to simplistic solutions or kind of rhetorical or extremist response to the problem, we see a rise in anti-Semitism. When we jump into the nuance of it, we don't see the anti-Semitism because we're dealing with truth. We're dealing with facts. The second question was Charlottesville. So The first remarkable thing about Charlottesville is that these people that participated in it were not tattooed. That was my first reaction. You know, for many years, when I would give, or when my predecessor would give a talk on the state of hate, it would be showing all these tattooed people, and the tattooed people would have an 88 on their forehead, which made it really easy for us to tell who you know, had these anti-Semitic beliefs. In Charlottesville, it was clearly intentional that these guys that gathered, mostly guys from around the country, this was pre-planned to present a face of mainstream, a face of normalcy. And it could have been, it would never have been a blip, but it could have been not nearly as impactful if it had been roundly condemned by everyone in leadership positions. But when the response is good people on both sides, it has a massive impact. So coming back to the problems, yes, yes, in that particular instance, the quote was from former President Trump. And I wasn't trying to be obtuse, I just kind of thought that everybody knew the quote, but I appreciate that. So Kanye's got a lot of problems. One of the, I don't like labels because I don't like fixing people in these simple terms, but influencer is one of the most precise labels out there. That is what Kanye is. He's an influencer. He's got, I don't know, 25 million. He's got more followers than there are Jews in the world. So when people appreciate somebody for their music or their political beliefs or their fashion, and that person is engaging in activity, or when they see somebody in positions of authority not clearly condemning, you need communal condemnation and you need engagement. And if the people in authority, wherever they are in the political spectrum, or communal leadership spectrum, are not condemning it clearly, then you're running the risk of normalization. And I think that's what we've seen since. And we said it then, and I think what we're seeing today is in part the result. Yeah.
So we're at the top of the hour. I don't know how many more questions would you like to take?
It's up to you. I have some stamina, but I don't want to keep anybody from moving on.
Do you have a question? Okay.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good. When does the freedom of speech counter extremism besides violence?
Fantastic question. And anybody that feels ready to go, please don't offend me by leaving. You won't offend me by leaving. So this is the fascinating, this is in many ways the big question of the day is, people call me and they say, I want to stop this speech. I want to shut this person up. How do we shut this person up? And my response is, well, there's this thing called the First Amendment that provides a lot of obstacles for shutting people up and for many, many good reasons. And so, but there are exceptions to the First Amendment. So this is not a new issue. There's been hate speech for, you know, ever. So, quick exception. If somebody stands in my face and says a anti-Semitic slur to me, they are imposing, and it's clear that their intent is to incite some kind of violent response from me. That's disturbing the peace. Like, that's literally the definition of disturbing the peace, right? If somebody goes on a website or in a newspaper, says something that's false about me, that implies that I am a thief, and says, you know, he's Jewish and he's a thief, defamation, there's no protection. Truth is not a defense to falsity targeting a specific individual. So there are these exceptions. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. But hate speech generally is protected speech. It is. It is here. It's not in Europe. They can outlaw specific words. They can criminalize words in Europe. We can't do that here. And one of the things that I think we should keep in mind is that that's to protect marginalized communities too. Because if we could outlaw certain words, you know, how easy would it be to say those that are protesting, those that are raising legitimate concerns, well, that's seditious, that's anti-government, and suddenly who ends up in jail? Okay, so No, right now we can't get somebody who's saying a general opinion that's a vile opinion that doesn't target a particular individual and is not specific enough. We can't silence them. But I wrote another article for the Montecito Journal that I think the headline was, speech may be protected, but it need not be free. It need not have no consequences. So coming back to the guys in Charlottesville, is that ADL and others identified a good number of these individuals that did this march, published that information, and a significant number of them lost their jobs. So there can be communal response that has real impact. The group that was over the 405, I know that may be on people's minds, with the Kanye is right. That was a group called the Goyim Defense League, kind of a takeoff on ADL, I suppose. That was they don't represent a movement. They represent about 5 guys that live, one of them lives up in Marin County, named John Minadeo, and they have made a business of monetizing hate. And so what they do is they'll go into they'll drive a truck around that has virulently anti-Semitic content on it, and they're just trying to provoke response in the community. They videotape it, and then they stream it, either live stream it or they stream it that night, and they ask people to give them money, and they get it. They're getting something like $600 an hour on these websites. And they'll say, I'm gonna go do this tomorrow, and when I do it, can you give me money? If I do this, will you give me money? We tracked this guy. We saw that he was taking a trip to Auschwitz. He talked about it. So we called Auschwitz and we said, this guy's coming. This guy and this other person are coming, beware. And they managed to get there. They actually held up a sign that was anti-ADL, and then they took off, but were eventually arrested. So what I'm coming back to is they're monetizing. So how do we now tackle the monetization of hate? And that gets interesting. Spending, courts have said spending is speech. Right? So finding that line of when does hate cross the line into conduct that is actionable, but more importantly, what kind of real life practical responses and consequences can we establish in response to it? And the reason I brought up the GDL is because the GDL, they don't hide their face or identity. They're out there, they're marketing their identity. We know exactly who they are. Right? And so they went over the 405 because they were maximizing a moment of possible attention. They were leveraging the Kanye moment to make money. The guys that concern me are the guys that are masked and over the freeway on the Portrait Overpass, concealing their identity. Because those guys actually, we don't know where they are, we don't know what they're doing, and we know it's important for them to conceal their identity. So the answer there is bring the light of day to who their identity is, and let their community express consequences and pushback and checking the behavior, right? So the cost of speech should be experiencing the blowback, the checking of your behavior when you engage in it. We got one in the back. Larry, right?
I appreciate everything you've discussed so far, but I was keeping count. You mentioned that anti-Semite previously referred to as Kanye. You mentioned him 9 times, and you uttered the word Trump once. A second time when I asked you to do so. This is the 360-pound gorilla in the room. The amount of anti-Semitism has grown drastically since he came into the public domain as a president. This week, it clearly expressed, where he stands with his dinner with Fuentes and West. He is a greater influencer than Kanye, with that many more people listening to his websites, and yet he did not get condemned to any great extent. He does not condemn Fuentes. He says, well, I don't know him, but he didn't condemn him. And when they explained,
even if that was true, which is ridiculous. They explained to him who he is. He still did not condemn him. And the ADL seems to be quiet about this topic, this former president. I'll say one last thing before I leave. He is clearly more of an anti-Semite than he is even a conservative or Republican. Those things are for his own benefit. But the anti-Semitism is intergenerational in him. And I really request that you talk about it.
So thank you for that question. So I think the morning after that, I saw Jonathan Greenblatt on CNN, and I saw him go off on Trump in a way that I haven't seen it before. And as a 501c3, we have to be very careful about wading into electoral politics. And if I'm going to talk about anybody that's an elected official or in an elected race, I need to get all kinds of clearances, and for good reasons, because we are not to weigh in on those issues. So that curtails us a bit. But I urge you to go find this appearance of Jonathan, I think it was on CNN, when he talks about that dinner, and see how he talks about former President Trump. When I'm talking about, I didn't use the words, but when I talked about the normalization of some of the right ideology, I was really referring to what some sources are now calling the MAGA right. And the MAGA right, Make America Great Again right, is the best way to describe it is they are the followers of Trump. They are the ones activating the narrative that he's put out about the Stop the Steal. And when I said that there were 50 million people calculated to be a part of that normalized, I was referring to attempts to quantify members of the MAGA right. Now, whether Trump is in his heart anti-Semitic or opportunist, I don't know. I'm not in that brain and don't want to be. But it's absolutely true, and I've talked a lot about the impact of authority, that we need to be commenting as much as we can about somebody who refuses to condone these beliefs or these activities. And go back and watch that, and then give me a call and see if you're comfortable with what he said and satisfied. Somebody who hasn't asked a question right up here, yeah. Okay, yeah, we'll just take this and one more.
Okay, you answered this a little bit indirectly already, but I want to flesh this out. Kanye, his complaints about Jews, it seemed like it stemmed from him being upset about the Jews in power that are affecting his life. How would you respond when he says, my lawyers are Jewish, my doctors are Jewish, my music executives are Jewish, and they're telling me what to do, they're oppressing me? When the truth is that most of the people in these powerful positions, or maybe not most, but he can really see the majority, are Jewish when they're not Black. So in really like a soundbite, in a Twitter response, how do you respond to that in a way that, how do we respond to that in a way that the general public can hear? Because they're not going to sit through your great talk for 90 minutes.
If he's had bad experiences with people, I think he should talk about those bad experiences and tell us the facts of those bad experiences, but not to jump to the conclusion that there's some common element between all of these people that have supposedly wronged him and that they have a common agenda. Because once he does that, he's now crossed the line of expressing a grievance to asserting a fallacy. And so it's pointing to where the fallacy happens. And the same is true with respect to criticism of Israel. And when does criticism of Israel, legitimate criticism of policies of the government of Israel, cross the line into anti-Semitism? That's a really important conversation to have. And it's pretty definable. It's pretty clear. So my response is hone in on where fact ends and fallacy begins.
I think Ira has a question here.
Okay, you get the last word. That's appropriate, Ira.
Yeah, but it's not a question, it's a comment.
Of course. I meant it.
Well, actually, I could start with a question asked myself. Why did I recommend Dan for this morning? You now know the answer. It's an extraordinary session. Not only the presentation, but the questions that were asked by our audience. And so thank you. I do want to point out one thing. We live in an age of, I'm dating myself, sound bites. Also, sound bites now in screen grabs. And every time, or many times when something is said, there's an immediate reaction to it. It goes back and forth and back and forth. That's not a conversation. And you pointed that out. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And it's work that needs to be done, not only when something erupts, but at the grassroots as it goes along. ADL, among many, many American Jewish organizations, does this work best of all. Many of those 450 people who work are working at the grassroots and working with school boards and other things that Dan has mentioned. A lot of programs that aren't well publicized because they're not terribly exciting, but they're terribly important because you're beginning to change minds by changing hearts and by looking into each other's eyes, and that's extremely important. So we'll win this battle. We have to. And among the leaders, or perhaps at the top of the board, are the people at ADL, like Dan, who are fighting this battle for us, and they deserve our support. Thank you.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.